Summer, 587 BCE. Jerusalem, Kingdom of Judah. Picture this. You are standing below the walls. Above you, the city sits on a ridge more than 700 meters high, separated from the surrounding hills by three deep valleys that fall away on almost every side. For generations, this position has kept Jerusalem safe from direct assault. A century earlier, an Assyrian army under King Sennacherib surrounded these same walls and then withdrew without ever breaching them. The people living inside took that outcome as evidence that their safety did not depend on military strength alone. Their God was said to dwell in the temple at the center of the city, and as long as that temple stood, many of them believed Jerusalem itself could not be taken. One empire now intends to test that belief directly: Babylon. Under King Nebuchadnezzar II, its army has already captured this city once before and installed a ruler of its own choosing. That ruler has broken his sworn word. Babylon's forces have returned to finish what they started. By every precedent this kingdom has known, the outcome should repeat itself. A fortified hill city, steep terrain on almost every approach, walls reinforced across generations, a population convinced that their God will not allow this place to fall. Now watch what happens. Within 2 years, the food inside these walls will run out completely. A section of the wall will give way. A king will try to escape the city at night and fail. The temple built by Solomon nearly 400 years earlier, its entrance flanked by 2 towering bronze pillars, will be stripped of everything valuable inside it and burned to the ground. This is the siege that ended the kingdom of Judah and the destruction of the first temple. To understand how a belief this old could collapse this completely, you need to see how Judah reached this point. Decades before this siege began, the empire that had dominated this region for centuries came apart. Assyria collapsed, and Babylon rose in its place. In 605 BCE, at a battle near Carchemish, Babylon's forces defeated an Egyptian army and secured control over the entire eastern Mediterranean coast, from the Euphrates River down to the border of Egypt itself. For the smaller kingdoms caught between these two powers, the choice became simple: pay tribute and remain in place, or resist and be removed. Judah's king, Jehoiakim, chose submission at first. He paid the tribute Babylon demanded and kept his throne. Nearby kingdoms along the coast made the same calculation and reached the same result. Their cities remained standing, their rulers remained in place. In 601 BCE, Babylon's army attempted to push into Egypt and suffered heavy losses in the attempt. Jehoiakim interpreted that failure as an opening. Against the direct warnings of the prophet Jeremiah, he stopped paying tribute and turned to Egypt for support instead. Nebuchadnezzar's response came quickly. Babylonian forces marched on Jerusalem. Jehoiakim died before the siege concluded, for reasons the surviving records do not make clear, and his young son Jeconiah inherited a war he had no part in starting. In March of 597 BCE, the city surrendered. Nebuchadnezzar chose not to destroy it. Instead, he stripped the temple of its treasures and deported the young king, along with much of the nobility, the skilled craftsmen, and a large portion of the priesthood, to Babylon. Later records place the number of people taken in this deportation at around 10,000, including 7,000 able-bodied men and 1,000 smiths, removing a large share of the workforce and leadership Judah would have needed to sustain any serious resistance on its own. In Jeconiah's place, Nebuchadnezzar installed an uncle, 21 years old at the time, Mattaniah, renamed Zedekiah. Before granting him the throne, Nebuchadnezzar required something beyond ordinary tribute. He bound Zedekiah with a formal oath, sworn in the name of Judah's own God, guaranteeing his loyalty to Babylon. Jerusalem was not simply one city among many on Babylon's list of vassals. It held the temple that formed the center of the kingdom's entire religious identity, and it sat along the corridor connecting Egypt to Babylon's territories in the north, a position valuable to whichever power controlled it. Loyal, Judah posed no threat to that corridor. Turned toward Egypt, it became a direct danger to Babylon's western border. Egypt had never fully accepted Babylon's control over this stretch of coastline. For more than a century, the two empires had traded influence over the same string of small kingdoms, and every ruler in the region understood that Egyptian support could reappear at any time, offering a tempting alternative to submission under Babylon. That temptation was the single greatest threat to Babylon's hold on its western territories. A loyal Judah blocked Egyptian influence from moving north along the coast. A rebellious one invited it back in. For a number of years, Zedekiah kept his oath. Judah continued as a subordinate kingdom, smaller and stripped of much of its former leadership, but intact. Jeremiah continued to argue that this arrangement, humiliating as it was, represented the safest available path for a kingdom this size, caught between two much larger powers. Inside Jerusalem, a different message dominated public life. Priests and prophets who told the population what it wanted to hear kept repeating a familiar assurance. The temple of the Lord stood in this city, and its presence alone guaranteed protection, regardless of anything else. Jeremiah stood at the temple gate itself and rejected that claim in public, in what later generations would call his temple sermon. He told the crowds arriving to worship that the building had never been the true source of their safety, that their God's protection had always depended on how they treated each other and who else they worshiped, and that trusting the temple's walls while ignoring the terms of their own covenant was a serious miscalculation. He reminded them that an earlier place of worship at Shiloh had once held a status just as sacred as Jerusalem's temple now held, and that it had been destroyed generations earlier regardless. Priests and prophets in the crowd seized him and called for his execution on the spot. He survived only because a group of officials intervened on his behalf. Then a new pharaoh, Hophra, took the throne in Egypt and began courting the small kingdoms along the eastern Mediterranean, offering military support against Babylon in exchange for their loyalty. Zedekiah accepted the offer. He sent envoys to Egypt requesting horses and soldiers, and in doing so broke the oath he had sworn to Nebuchadnezzar. That oath had been sworn in the name of Judah's own God, not simply as a diplomatic formality between two kings. Breaking it was treated as more than a political maneuver. It was treated as a violation of a binding, sacred promise. The prophet Ezekiel, already living among the exiles in Babylon, delivered a public message comparing Zedekiah to a plant that had turned away from the very source keeping it alive, warning that a ruler who despised an oath sworn in his own God's name could not expect that God's protection in return. Jeremiah warned Zedekiah directly, in person, that the alliance with Egypt would fail, and that breaking his sworn word would bring the exact outcome he was trying to avoid. Zedekiah heard the warning and rebelled regardless. Nebuchadnezzar's response was immediate. In the 10th month of Zedekiah's 9th year, in midwinter, the Babylonian army marched into Judah and encircled Jerusalem. The city presented a genuine military problem, not an easy one. Jerusalem sat more than 700 meters above sea level, on a ridge bounded by the Kidron Valley to the east and the Hinnom Valley to the south and west, both steep enough on their own to blunt a direct assault. Its walls had been reinforced across multiple generations. One section, more than 7 meters thick at its base, had been raised generations earlier specifically to withstand the Assyrian siege, absorbing older houses and walls directly into its foundation. A spring called Gihon, and an underground tunnel cut directly through bedrock under an earlier king, Hezekiah, carried that water inside the city walls, giving Jerusalem a source no outside blockade could interrupt. A quick assault carried an unacceptable cost. A short blockade would not starve a city this well prepared for one. Nebuchadnezzar himself did not remain at the siege lines for its duration. He directed the campaign from a headquarters at Riblah to the north, leaving his field commanders to carry out the daily work of the blockade. So Nebuchadnezzar chose patience over force. His engineers built mounds of packed earth against sections of the outer wall, constructed wooden forts to shelter archers and observers, and raised a wall of circumvallation sealing the entire perimeter, closing every route in or out of the city. Battering rams were assembled and moved into position at multiple points along the fortifications. This was not designed as a quick siege. It was designed as a prolonged occupation of the ground itself, sustained until the city inside had nothing left to sustain its own defense. In Babylon, years earlier, the prophet Ezekiel had already acted out this exact plan in public. He scratched a drawing of Jerusalem onto a clay tablet, built a miniature ramp and a miniature wall around it, and set up small camps and toy battering rams facing the image. He then placed an iron pan upright between himself and the model, a wall of his own, and lay on his side in front of it for well over a year, acting out the length of the coming siege as a public warning of what was still to come. As the siege works around Jerusalem rose, Babylon did not commit its entire force to this single target. Judah's other fortified cities fell to Babylonian forces one after another, eliminating any realistic hope of relief reaching Jerusalem from within its own kingdom. A set of letters written on broken pottery by a field officer named Hoshea, stationed near Lachish, one of the last fortresses still holding out, were addressed to his commanding officer Yaosh, and describe watching each night for signal fires from the neighboring city of Azekah. In one of the final surviving letters, Hoshea reports that Azekah's fires can no longer be seen. Excavators would recover these letters more than 2,000 years later, still lying in the guard room where they had been received. Judah's entire defensive network was being taken apart piece by piece, and Jerusalem was being left increasingly alone. Inside the besieged city, Zedekiah made one further concession under pressure: a covenant, sworn in the temple itself, to free all Hebrew slaves held by their fellow Judahites, in keeping with a law that had gone unenforced for generations. It was presented as an act of obedience to their God at a moment of national crisis. Then word reached the Babylonian camp that Pharaoh Hopher's army had crossed into southern Judah. Nebuchadnezzar's forces broke off the siege and marched south to meet this new threat directly. And for the first time in months, no Babylonian soldiers surrounded Jerusalem's walls. Inside the city, this felt like deliverance. Zedekiah sent messengers to Jeremiah, asking him to pray on the kingdom's behalf. Citizens who had just freed their slaves under the new covenant took them back into bondage now that the danger seemed to have passed. Jeremiah condemned that reversal specifically, calling it a second broken covenant in addition to the first, and warning it would not go unanswered. He told the king plainly that Pharaoh's army would retreat back to Egypt, that Babylon's army would return to finish the siege, and that even if the defenders of Jerusalem managed to strike down every Babylonian soldier but the wounded, those wounded men would still rise from their tents and burn the city to the ground. For delivering that message, Jeremiah was arrested as he tried to leave the city during the lull in the siege, accused of defecting to the enemy. He was beaten and imprisoned. Officials who considered his message dangerous to morale later had him lowered by rope into an empty cistern to die slowly of exposure and hunger. A court official named Ebed-Melech petitioned Zedekiah directly on Jeremiah's behalf and was granted permission to pull him back out, using old rags to cushion the ropes under his arms. Even from inside a mudded cistern, Jeremiah's message did not change. Zedekiah's own position made resistance to his officials difficult. More than once during the siege, he summoned Jeremiah in secret and asked what word had come from God, and each time received the same answer: surrender to Babylon and live, or resist and watch the city burn. Zedekiah believed him. He admitted as much in private, but he feared his own officers, several of whom had already defected to the Babylonian side, more than he feared the prophecy itself, and he never acted on what he was told. Jeremiah's warning proved accurate almost immediately. Pharaoh Hopher's army withdrew without giving battle, retreating back toward Egypt rather than engaging Nebuchadnezzar's forces directly. Whatever hope its brief appearance had created inside Jerusalem did not last more than a few weeks. The Babylonian army returned to the walls it had left and resumed the work exactly where it had stopped. The remaining fortress cities that had not already fallen were reduced one by one. The siege wall around Jerusalem's own perimeter was completed in full. Every gap that supplies, reinforcements, or refugees might once have used was sealed shut. From this point forward, nothing entered the city, and nothing left it. With the perimeter fully closed, the character of the siege changed. This was no longer a campaign of movement. It was a slow removal of everything the city needed to keep functioning as a place people could survive in. Food supplies, never built to outlast a siege stretching well over a year, began to run out. The Book of Lamentations, composed in the aftermath by someone who lived through the siege directly, describes small children fainting from hunger in the city's streets, and describes people's skin darkening and drawing tight against their bones. It describes conditions inside the walls as worse than the famine that had struck the city when it was invaded generations earlier. Ezekiel, watching from exile, had prophesied this exact famine years before it happened, describing a population forced to measure out food and water in small, anxious portions, uncertain whether each day's ration would be the last. By the 9th day of the 4th month, in the height of summer, In the 11th year of Zedekiah's reign, after close to a year and a half of continuous siege, the food inside Jerusalem ran out entirely. There was nothing left to distribute to the people of the city. Soldiers still manning the walls were defending the city on empty stomachs, with no prospect of relief and no remaining reserves left to draw on. At the same time, Babylonian forces pressed their siege works forward, concentrating their rams and their soldiers against specific points along the wall, rather than spreading pressure evenly across the entire perimeter. The defenders, weakened by months without adequate food, held their positions for as long as they physically could. But a defense weakened by starvation cannot continue forever, regardless of the defender's courage. The attacking army only needed to wait. On that same 9th day, the wall gave way. A breach opened along the southern section. Babylonian soldiers moved toward it in force. Zedekiah did not surrender. He ran. Under cover of night, the king and his remaining soldiers slipped out through a gate near the royal garden, between the city's two walls, and fled east toward the Jordan Valley. Babylonian forces gave chase immediately. They caught him on the plains of Jericho, his army scattered in every direction. Zedekiah stood alone, or close to it. He was taken north, to Riblah, where Nebuchadnezzar himself was waiting to pass judgment in person. There Zedekiah watched his own sons executed in front of him. It was the last thing his eyes ever saw. His eyes were put out immediately afterward. He was bound in bronze shackles and led away to Babylon, blind, to spend the rest of his life as a prisoner. The city itself was still standing when this happened. That did not last much longer. About a month later, Nebuzaradan, commander of the Imperial Guard, entered Jerusalem carrying orders to finish what the siege had started. He set fire to the temple first, then the royal palace, then every significant house remaining in the city. Soldiers pulled down the walls that had stood for centuries, section by section, until nothing defensible remained standing. The temple's two bronze pillars named Jachin and Boaz, cast under Solomon's original construction, nearly 400 years earlier and standing more than 8 meters tall, were broken apart for their raw metal and hauled to Babylon along with the temple's gold and silver vessels, its basins, its fire pans, and every remaining tool used in its daily service. The high priest, Sariah, and the priest ranked second beneath him, Zephaniah, were taken to Riblah along with the temple's remaining guardians, a military officer, several of the king's own advisors, and dozens of other men found hiding in the city. Nebuchadnezzar had all of them executed there, alongside members of the royal household. Thousands of Judah's surviving population were marched into exile in Babylon, joining the nobles and craftsmen deported after the first siege more than a decade earlier. Only the poorest residents were left behind, assigned to work land that no longer belonged to any kingdom. The kingdom of Judah, which had existed in some form since David first united it roughly 4 centuries earlier, stopped functioning as an independent state. Nebuchadnezzar appointed a governor named Gedaliah to administer whatever population remained, an arrangement that collapsed within months, when Gedaliah himself was assassinated by members of the very community he had been assigned to govern. Fearing Babylonian retaliation for the killing, most of the remaining population fled south into Egypt, the same power Zedekiah had relied on for protection, reversing a journey their ancestors were remembered for making in the opposite direction, centuries before. A century earlier, an army had surrounded these same walls and withdrawn without ever breaching them, and that single outcome had become a fixed assumption, that Jerusalem and the temple inside it could not truly fall to any invader. This time the walls did not hold, the temple did not remain standing. This time the city fell. Jeremiah, who had spent decades warning that a building could never substitute for a kept promise, watched that warning confirmed in the most direct way available to him. The temple he had preached in front of no longer existed. Babylon had demonstrated that no fortified hill city, regardless of its walls or the confidence of its people, stood beyond its reach. But Babylon's own dominance over this region would not outlast a single generation. Within about 50 years, the empire that broke Jerusalem's walls after a siege lasting more than a year would itself be taken by a Persian king named Cyrus, whose own forces entered Babylon's capital in a matter of days, meeting almost no resistance inside the city at all. Within about a year of that conquest, Cyrus issued a formal decree permitting the exiles Nebuchadnezzar had carried away to return home and rebuild the temple that had been burned. Tens of thousands would eventually make that journey back. That conquest, the decree that followed it, and the end of Babylon's own empire, is a different account entirely.